Now, in Washington, the U.S. Secretary of State and the CIA director have been briefing congressional leaders on why the Trump administration launched those strikes on Iran. The answer they received, that the U.S. was following Israel's lead. Republican Representative and House Speaker Mike Johnson gave us more details.
The most critical point is that this was a defensive measure, a defensive operation. And why is that? I took some notes, and this is not classified, so I'll tell you what I think is important. Israel was determined to act in their own defense here, with or without American support. Why? Because Israel faced what they deemed to be an existential threat. Iran was building missiles at a radical and a rapid clip to the point where our allies in the region could not keep up. As you know, Iran has long vowed to take out Israel, wipe it off the map, and they have long seen that as a critical threat to their very existence. Because Israel was determined to act, with or without the U.S., our commander-in-chief and the administration and the officials I just named had a very difficult decision to make. They had to evaluate the threats to the U.S., to our troops, to our installations, to our assets in the region and beyond, and they determined, because of the exquisite intelligence that we had, that if Israel fired upon Iran and took action against Iran to take out the missiles, then they would have immediately retaliated against U.S. personnel and assets. We have troops in harm's way, and we have many Americans in the region, and that was of great concern. If we had waited for all of those eventualities to take place, the consequences of inaction on our part could have been devastating.
Democratic Senator Mark Warner says Donald Trump needs to explain his objectives to the U.S. Congress.
When we are talking about putting American soldiers in harm's way, when we have American casualties and expectations of more, there needs to be the proof of an imminent threat to American interest. I still don't think that standard has been met. I think the president needs to come before the Congress, and for that matter, the American people, and decide amongst these 4 or 5 goals that have been laid out, what is the real goal?
Joining us from San Diego in California is Henry Ensher, former U.S. Ambassador and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Thank you for joining the program. So, as we heard there, strong criticism from Democrats that President Donald Trump acted without congressional approval. Legally and politically, how vulnerable is the administration on that front?
Well, thanks very much for having me. And look, I'm certainly not an expert on American politics, but I can tell you that particularly the rhetoric that was used today about the need to strike Iran because Israel was going to do so will have effects throughout the region. And we can see the Iranians taking advantage of that already. And it will have effects here as well in the United States. A lot of Americans, I think that our Middle East policy is greatly affected by what Israel wants. Some people would go so far as to say that Israel is leading our Middle East policy. So that rhetoric will play into those suspicions here, and I think ultimately will have some effect. I suspect we'll see the administration talking more about U.S. national interests and why it was necessary for the U.S. to act on the basis of those interests going forward.
Going by what President Donald Trump said overnight, that the campaign has 4 aims: destroying Iran's missile capabilities, annihilating its navy, preventing a nuclear weapon, and stopping Tehran from funding armed groups abroad. How realistic are those objectives militarily achievable without a wider regional war?
Well, I mean, look, we're in a wider regional war already. Iran has struck back at several targets in the Gulf, including several capital cities. So I think we're already there. What I think is happening here is that both sides, the Iranians and the Americans, are using violence as a way to get back to a negotiation on the most favorable terms. I think where we are now if the U.S. administration wanted to, it could plausibly claim victory. That is to say, it has decapitated the leadership of Iran. It claims to have sunk the Iranian Navy. It's crippled Iran's ability to fund additional proxies in the region. And it has struck hard at U.S. at Iranian missile facilities. They could do more on the missiles, but getting to the point now, actually, where if the administration wanted to do so, and if political calculations required it to do so, it could plausibly claim victory and head back to the negotiating table. But on the other hand, we hear that President Trump is prepared to continue for weeks.
And on the negotiating table point, I mean, realistically, given what we've been hearing from the Iranian side and the lack of trust, and we can't blame them for that with the U.S. administration when it comes to diplomacy, how realistic is it that we can get back to negotiating?
Oh, I think it's very realistic, actually. A lot of wars, most wars, end with some kind of negotiation, and I think we will be there now. This is not a war that will result in the United States driving on Tehran and actually conquering it. We've seen that a few times in the region recently, but the U.S. force is not configured to do that, which means that the only solution is some form of negotiation. So I think we'll get there sooner or later. Both sides are using violence as a message, as I said earlier, and also talking tough, but I think with a view to getting back to a negotiation on the best possible basis.
We've seen already in the space of a few days, 6 U.S. service members killed in the region, I believe 18 seriously wounded. This is according to figures from U.S. Central Command. How much domestic pressure does this place, this sort of damage place on the U.S. president, especially if casualties continue to rise?
So I think the administration has some time and has some space. 6 casualties is already a lot. Obviously, that means that there are 6 families which are facing the worst possible nightmare. But I think that the number is not so great that it will yet have political effects. Obviously, we are only ever one strike away from a catastrophe, right? A very large-scale casualty event, and something on that order could have grave political effects very quickly. But I don't think we're there yet, and I think the president still has some scope in the United States to continue the war for as long as he deems necessary.
Back home in the U.S., we know the Democrats are clearly unhappy with where things are going. They're moving under the War Powers Resolution to try and force a vote on this war within a week. But I want to ask about the Republican side, and within parts of the Republican base, there have always been these accusations against these forever wars. What is your sense of how loud those voices are now within the Republican side and those MAGA voices?
Yeah, so getting louder, actually, I have to say. I'm a faithful consumer of a lot of different kinds of media, and I can tell you that there's distinct nervousness on the more conservative side of the spectrum here. They do not want to be involved in any more wars in the Middle East. They place a great deal of trust in the president, and that is capital, after all, that he can spend for a period of time. And as long as we don't have mass casualties, and as long as the war seems to be going okay, he's got some space, he's got some trust to use with that group, but it is not infinite, I don't think. And of course, beyond the War Powers Resolution, which doesn't have any teeth in it, we're heading into an election period. In fact, the first primaries are tomorrow. So that will have an effect.
Henry, really good to get your thoughts. Henry Ensher, former U.S. ambassador and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State.
Pleasure.